Molten gold sizzled as it touched the man's lips. Marcus Licinius Crassus, once the richest man in Rome, gurgled in agony. The liquid gold cascaded down his throat, searing flesh and silencing his screams. In that horrific moment, the wealth he craved became the instrument of his destruction, and a stunned audience of his captors watched the richest Roman meet a death as grotesque as any legend. Marcus Licinius Crassus was no ordinary man. He was Rome's wealthiest magnate and a powerful politician, a member of the famous First Triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey. Crassus's name was synonymous with wealth and ambition. Yet it was that very ambition, a relentless greed for glory and gold, that led him down a path of war and ultimately to a fate so brutal that it defies imagination. His gruesome end at the hands of Rome's enemies sent shockwaves through the ancient world. How did Crassus go from being the richest man in Rome to dying in such macabre fashion, with molten gold poured into his throat? The story unfolds in a tale of pride, betrayal, and horrifying punishment that still fascinates and repels us in equal measure. The brutality to come would forever mark history, showing how one man's thirst for fortune brought about one of the most chilling deaths on record. To understand how Crassus met his awful end, we must set the scene. The year is 53 BCE. Rome is at the height of its power, yet internal rivalries run deep. Crassus, despite his immense wealth, craved the military glory that his rivals Caesar and Pompey had earned. He had earned fame years before by crushing the slave revolt of Spartacus. And in a ghastly display of Roman vengeance, 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, their dying bodies lining the road as a warning to all. Crassus was no stranger to brutality. He himself had ordered mass crucifixions to instill fear. Now, in his early 60s, he sought to crown his career with a spectacular conquest. His eyes turned east to the Parthian Empire, a wealthy realm in modern-day Middle East that he thought would be an easy prize. But there were ominous signs from the start. The campaign against Parthia had no clear provocation. Even some Romans whispered that this war was driven by Crassus's personal greed rather than Rome's necessity. In the streets of Rome, people spoke of ill omens. According to ancient accounts, as Crassus marched out of the city with his legions, a tribune named Gaius Attius Capito stood at the gates performing a sinister ritual. He pronounced a curse on Crassus, calling upon dark gods to bring doom upon the greedy general. Many recoiled at this public hex, seeing it as a terrible sign of what was to come. Crassus, proud and stubborn, ignored the warnings. He had never lost a fortune, and he would not lose this chance at glory. With 7 legions under his command, around 40,000 men, Crassus invaded Parthia. The wealthy Roman imagined a swift victory and plunder beyond measure. However, fate and folly conspired against him. He rejected sound advice, spurning an offer of extra troops and a safer route from Armenia's king, and led his army directly into the Mesopotamian desert. The Parthians, masters of mounted warfare, were waiting. Their leader was a brilliant general named Surena, who was as cunning as he was ruthless. Surena tricked Crassus by using a false guide to lure the Roman army far from water and into open plains where the Parthian cavalry roamed free. In the blazing desert sun near the town of Carrhae, Crassus's legions met the Parthian force. What unfolded was a nightmare for the Romans. Waves of armored horsemen and swift horse archers descended upon them, drum beats thundering across the plain. The Parthian riders unleashed dark clouds of arrows that seemed never to cease. Roman shields rattled under the onslaught of countless barbed missiles. Soldiers collapsed in heaps, transfixed by arrows that fell like rain upon them. Crassus, unused to such warfare, watched in mounting panic as his proud legions were pinned down and systematically butchered from a distance. Amid the chaos, Crassus's own son, Publius Licinius Crassus led a desperate charge to drive off the horse archers. Publius was young and bold, eager to prove himself. He and his cavalry galloped after the feigning Parthian riders, only to be led into a trap. Surena's men encircled Publius's detachment. In a swirling melee of dust and blood, Publius and his companions were overwhelmed. The Romans back at the main camp realized too late the horror that had befallen the young commander. The Parthians announced their victory in the most ghastly way imaginable. They rode toward the Roman lines, holding aloft a gruesome trophy, Publius's severed head mounted on a spear. Crassus stood transfixed with horror as his son's lifeless eyes and blood-matted hair came into view. The sight of his beloved son's head dripping with blood sent a shudder through the Roman ranks. The father's heart sank. The army's morale crumbled. Yet, terrible as it was, this was only the beginning of Crassus's nightmare. Night fell on a scene of carnage. Thousands of Romans lay dead or dying in the sand. Crassus, shattered by his son's brutal death and facing a hopeless situation, now only wished to save the remnants of his army. Under cover of darkness, he fled with survivors to the town of Carrhae. The once proud general was now a desperate man on the run. But Surena was not about to let Rome's richest man escape his grasp. He wanted Crassus to pay, and pay dearly. The next day, the Parthian commander offered to negotiate. He sent word that he was willing to discuss terms for the Romans to surrender and be allowed to go free. Crassus's troops, exhausted, wounded, and furious at their leader's mistakes, demanded that he accept the parley. They would mutiny rather than march another step. With great reluctance and dread, Crassus agreed to meet Surena. Perhaps he clung to a faint hope that some of his men might be spared. Or perhaps he knew he was walking into a trap and saw no other choice. At the appointed place, Crassus and his officers met Surena and a small Parthian entourage. Tension hung thick in the air. According to later reports, the talks quickly turned heated. Surena's men allegedly produced a fake document of peace and asked Crassus to place his hand on it as if to formalize a treaty. Crassus realized too late it was a ruse to grab hold of him. In the confusion, a scuffle broke out. Roman officers drew swords. Parthian warriors grappled with them in the sand. Crassus tried to pull away, and chaos erupted. The last surviving Roman general of the battle was thrown from his horse. In the melee that ensued, Crassus's fate was sealed. Overpowered and at the mercy of his enemy, Crassus was taken captive by the Parthians. What followed would become the stuff of legend, a punishment so cruel and symbolic that it has echoed through history. The Parthians had their hated Roman general in chains. They could have simply killed him with a sword to the heart, ending his life swiftly. But Surena and his men had something far more spectacular in mind. Crassus's own character flaw, his insatiable greed, dictated the method of his execution. The victors decided to make Marcus Crassus a living embodiment of what they saw as Roman avarice. The Roman general who had chased wealth and glory into Parthia was about to endure a death tailored as a dark parody of his life. Crassus's captors prepared his punishment with fiendish deliberation. The once proud Roman commander was likely bound or held down, forced to his knees in humiliation. We can imagine the scene. A circle of Parthian soldiers and officers gathered around, their faces cold with contempt and triumph. Perhaps King Orodes II's envoys were present too, eager to witness the downfall of Rome's richest man. In the center, Marcus Crassus, bruised, terrified, and exhausted, awaited his doom. A heavy cauldron was brought forth, and into it was thrown a heap of gold, perhaps coins, jewelry, and gold seized from the Roman baggage, maybe even Crassus's own treasured wealth captured in the rout. A fire was stoked beneath the vessel. As minutes passed, the solid gold began to glow and liquefy into a molten, bubbling brew. The heat was intense. Those nearest shielded their faces from the blast of the flames. One can only imagine Crassus's eyes widening in realization of what they planned for him. This was no mere execution, it was a vile spectacle. Two soldiers seized Crassus by the arms and wrenched his mouth open, tilting his head back. He tried to twist away, but there was no escape. Surena himself, or one of his henchmen, took up the crucible of molten gold, now incandescent and shimmering with lethal heat. In that moment, time must have seemed to slow for Crassus. The man who had once hungered insatiably for gold was about to eat it in its most terrifying form. "Open wide," someone might have sneered, mocking the rich Roman. And then, with a steady hand, they poured the molten gold into Crassus's gaping mouth. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The liquid gold, heated to a temperature above 1,000 degrees, scalded his lips, tongue, and throat in an instant. Crassus would have tried to scream, but no sound could escape. The molten metal seared his voice box and charred his throat as it rushed downward. Smoke and the smell of burning flesh billowed from his mouth and nostrils. His body convulsed violently, his eyes bulged in indescribable pain. The gold burned through tissues, a fire coursing inside him. In those few ghastly seconds, Marcus Crassus was literally being burned from within. Witnesses say that as the golden liquid overflowed from his mouth, the Parthians jeered at their once mighty enemy. "Drink, Crassus, drink!" they shouted, taunting him with cruel laughter. They asked if he was enjoying the taste of his long-sought gold. The richest man in Rome was being force-fed his riches, and it was the last thing he would ever taste. Crassus's thrashing eventually ceased, his charred throat and lungs ensuring a swift death. The Roman who had lived for wealth died choking on it in unspeakable agony. The molten gold cooled and solidified inside his corpse, a macabre treasure embedded in the lifeless body. But the victors were not done. In a final act of triumph and scorn, they severed Crassus's head from his corpse. The bloodied head, with gold hardened in its gaping mouth, was held high for all to see. The Parthians had turned Crassus into a grim object lesson. His fate was sealed with gold and steel, and his corpse was treated like spoils of war. Still not satisfied, Surena sent Crassus's head, and according to some sources, his hand as well, as a gift to King Orodes II, who was jubilantly celebrating the victory. The nightmare was over for Crassus, but his story of humiliation was not yet complete. The news of Crassus's horrific demise sent tremors through Rome. An entire Roman army had been annihilated, 20,000 legionaries slain, and 10,000 more taken prisoner, making the Battle of Carrhae one of Rome's worst defeats. But even more shocking than the military disaster was the manner of Crassus's death. Romans struggled to comprehend how one of their top leaders had been subjected to such a theatrical and gruesome punishment. In Parthia, however, Crassus's end was a cause for dark celebration. King Orodes II reportedly laughed when he saw the severed head of Crassus. In fact, at the king's victory feast, the Parthians staged a cruel piece of theater to ridicule their fallen foe. Orodes II's court was entertained with a performance of the Greek tragedy The Bacchae by Euripides. In that play, a prideful king is beheaded as punishment for his arrogance. The Parthians took full advantage of the coincidence. Crassus's severed head, now said to be filled with solidified gold, was brought out as a prop in the play. An actor held up the head during the performance, as if Crassus himself were playing the doomed king in the tragedy. Gulls of laughter and applause echoed through the banquet hall at this gruesome sight. The once richest man of Rome was now reduced to a macabre punchline in a foreign king's court. To further mock Roman pride, one of Crassus's captured officers who resembled him was dressed in women's clothing and paraded as Crassus in a humiliating parody of a Roman triumph. The Parthians spared no effort in making Crassus's downfall a spectacle to remember. Back in Rome, the effect of this catastrophe was profound. Crassus's death shattered the balance of power in the Roman Republic. He had been the glue between Caesar and Pompey. With Crassus gone and his immense wealth removed from Roman politics, the first triumvirate collapsed. Soon, mistrust and rivalry between the remaining two triumvirs led to civil war, a conflict that would ultimately end the Roman Republic and usher in the age of emperors. In that sense, the gold that silenced Crassus also rang the death knell for an era of Roman history. Yet beyond the political consequences, Crassus's fate became an enduring cautionary tale. Roman writers for generations recounted the story of the greedy general punished by gold. The morality was clear. Crassus's insatiable thirst for wealth and glory had invited a terrible retribution. His gruesome end was held up as a warning of what arrogance and avarice could bring. The fact that his own methods had been cruel. Recall the thousands he crucified after Spartacus's revolt, only added a sense of dark poetic justice to his story. He who had dealt in death and greed died by a death fashioned from greed itself. The death of Marcus Licinius Crassus stands as one of history's darkest ironies. A man who had wealth, power, and status, yet craved more, only to die far from Rome with molten gold poured into his throat. His gruesome fate remains a chilling symbol of greed punished by its own object, a spectacle that showed even the mightiest could be brought low in the most grotesque way. More than 2,000 years later, his story still grips us as a stark warning about pride, cruelty, and the devastating cost of unbridled ambition. How does this story make you feel? Does it horrify you, or make you ponder the price of ambition? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this tale of torture sent shivers down your spine, subscribe for more. History is filled with tales of such dark brutality that they sound like nightmares. Marcus Crassus's fate is one of those nightmares, a true story that forces us to question our own desires and limits. If you thought this was horrifying, wait until you hear about the man whose intestines were pulled out. But that is a tale for another time. For now, let the tragic fall of Crassus serve as a bloody reminder. Sometimes the greed we carry can come back to destroy us in the most dreadful of ways.